Okay, the final fourth talk is called Remembering and Forgetting King, and hopefully the previous three lectures have shown that I believe that Martin Luther King is not well remembered. He's often misrepresented, and important aspects of his life and philosophy are largely forgotten. So, in my view, we need to remember that Dr. King was not a hero who created the civil rights movement, but a man who discovered his courage and purpose in the freedom struggle and through the freedom struggle. We need to appreciate that his non-violence was not a moderate, conciliatory approach that tried to extract concessions in a spirit of compromise, but a radical, confrontational strategy that cultivated a sense of crisis to compel reluctant authorities to give ground. We need to question the conventional contrast between King's approach and the Black Power approach offered by figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. If Black Power meant the ability of people of African descent to use their cultural, economic and political resources to direct their lives along a fair and just path, then King was a wholehearted supporter. But he believed in organised actions and measured language rather than protests that leaders could not control and language that united their enemies more effectively than it mobilised their followers. When King was murdered on April the 4th, 1968, a wave of anger swept Black America with violent clashes in many cities, notably Washington, D.C., and that's northwest Washington on April the 5th. To his followers, his assassination was a political act designed to take their leader in order to weaken the movement. Seeking to restore order, white authorities from the president down called for calm out of respect for a man of peace. In Memphis, where the white mayor had been obstinately blocking the campaign to secure union recognition for the garbage collectors, a deal was struck that guaranteed collective bargaining. In Congress, where conservatives had been resisting proposals for a law to ban racial discrimination in the property market, the Fair Housing Act was passed. Each gain, local and national, could be seen as a memorial to Martin Luther King. The international reaction amplified the different ways in which King could be used now by factions. In apartheid South Africa, the Afrikaans newspaper, De Vaderland, remarked that King was a victim of evil racist passions that he had helped to excite, but ultimately could not control. In West Germany, his death was linked to the assassination of John F. Kennedy as evidence of America's political instability. The federal parliament in Bonn held a silent tribute, and 1,000 mourners marched behind Berlin's mayor to a ceremony in John F. Kennedy Platz. As with Kennedy, Germans feared King was the victim of a conspiracy sparked by his outspoken opposition to the Vietnam War. The Swiss newspaper, Süddeutsche Zeitung, envisaged a spiral of increasingly radical protest and violent repression, and warned its German readers, even Bismarck realised that one does not sit comfortably on bayonets in the long run. Behind the Iron Curtain, King was seen as a martyred victim of US racism and imperialism. The Soviet newspaper Izvestia discussed the assassination under the headline, "United States is a nation of violence and racism." In East Germany, the government newspaper Deutschland declared that the White House lay behind King's murder, largely because he had highlighted the indissoluble link between Washington's external politics of aggression and its internal terror. It said hundreds of thousands were now ready to join the international front against the barbaric imperialism of the US and its allies. Blatantly propagandistic, this interpretation of King foreshadowed the reality that as the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular in America by the mid-70s, King's opposition to it was no longer seen by Middle America as a betrayal of his country. Similarly, helping to reshape white recollection of the slain civil rights leader Martin Luther King was the more separatist rhetoric of black protest in the early 70s, with groups like the Black Panthers. In this context, the repeated invocation of King's "I Have a Dream" speech entrenched the idea that his commitment to non-violence symbolized a better, less abrasive time, nostalgically remembered. Many forgot how in the summer of 1966, 2/3 of Americans polled viewed King unfavourably. By the time a fellow Georgian, Jimmy Carter, entered the White House in 1977 and appointed King's close aide Andrew Young as his UN ambassador, there was a cultivated illusion that King's brand of peaceful racial reform had been embraced by Americans willingly. This foreshadowed what historian Glenn Eskew has termed the one version, the one cause version of the movement. So once upon a time, the white South lost the Civil War and came up with this idea of the lost cause. Now they've developed the myth of the one cause, with King at its heroic centre in a narrative that stressed that things have been won, the progress has been made, the battle is over. King can be sanctified in this account because its implicit message is that the past is past. David Vann, former Birmingham mayor and backer of that city's Civil Rights Institute, depicted here, which commemorates the 1963 campaign, revealed perhaps more than he intended in 1992 when it opened. He said, "I've always said that the best way to put bad images to rest is to declare them history and put them in a museum." The main talking point in relation to King himself during the 70s was the assassination, which after revelations in mid-decade about the clandestine operations of the FBI and the counterintelligence project seemed plausibly to have been a conspiracy that might reach to the heart of government. The 1974 murder of King's mother, killed by a deranged gunman whilst playing the organ in Ebenezer Church, certainly added a ghoulish fascination. The counterintelligence program had involved illegal surveillance, the use of agents provocateurs and other infiltrators to destabilise radical groups like Black Panthers, and countless other illegal acts include the systematic phone tapping of Martin Luther King. These revelations came on top of President Nixon's resignation over Watergate, so many people were wary of the federal government's capacity for illegal action. While exposure of official repression fueled radical outrage, many mainstream Americans in the Carter years began to see the 60s as the time when things went wrong, a sentiment that the current economic malaise and faltering relations with the Soviet Union deepened. So in that cultural landscape, King's memory became a contested commodity deployed in contradictory ways. By the end of the 70s, conservatives were starting to see that they could potentially co-opt King's memory in a way that they could never have co-opted King. So they gave up denouncing him as a communist subversive. White preacher Jerry Falwell, founder of the Moral Majority, had been a King critic in the 60s, but by 1981 he was happy to describe his anti-abortion, anti-gay rights campaign as one that emulated Dr. King and followed in his footsteps. This was part of a broader effort to undermine affirmative action programs and other civil rights gains by popularizing the view that what Martin Luther King really wanted was color blindness. Ronald Reagan's appointee to the Civil Rights Commission, Clarence Pendleton, declared that the Commission's goal was a colour-blind society. Reagan's Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds, the white guy on the right there, declared the US Constitution was colour-blind on civil rights, and innumerable neoconservatives quoted the line that King had always wanted people to be judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin, and so affirmative action was wrong. Martin Luther King would have opposed it. This ignored the evidence that the job market was stacked against African Americans, even with some affirmative action in place. Between 1981 and 1984, black unemployment rose from 14.3 to 15.9%, while white unemployment was stuck in the 6.3 to 6.5 range. This makes it particularly ironic that it was Reagan, a president who did so little for African Americans, who signed into law the bill creating Martin Luther King Day as a federal holiday. He signed it on November the 2nd, 1983. Efforts to secure a national holiday had begun just 4 days after King's assassination, when black Congressman John Conyers had introduced a bill into the House of Representatives. In 1978, the National Council of Churches had urged Congress to pass national holiday legislation, and millionaire pop star Stevie Wonder became a particularly strong backer, releasing his hit single Happy Birthday in 1980 to rally support. The following year, he funded the Holiday Coalition offices in Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress. And by 1982, the Coalition for King Day had secured over 6 million signatures on petitions. As a sure sign of which way the political wind was blowing, President Reagan issued a public statement on King's birthday in 1983. History shows that Dr. King's approach, he said, achieved great results in a comparatively short time, which was exactly what America needed. What he accomplished, not just for black Americans, but for all Americans, he lifted a heavy burden from our country. Implicitly, Reagan was saying the burden, racism, was now gone.
Really?
By the time the Senate passed the bill in October 1983 by a vote of 78 to 22, support for King Day had been further boosted by a turnout of nearly 750,000 people to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. Pressed at the November signing ceremony, depicted here, on his own view of King, particularly whether King was a communist agent, the genially right-wing Reagan alluded to the sealed tapes and records that won't be available until 2027 and said, "We'll have to wait and see." Securing the King holiday has proved an ambiguous victory, probably a defeat in key ways, since it has involved a seemingly inevitable dilution of King's specifically African American and radical legacy in favour of more uncontentious national platitudes. Further legislation has reinforced this tendency in 1994 when President Bill Clinton signed the King Holiday and Service Day. As far as I know, it's only Memorial Day that has something specific that you do on the holiday, which is go, in the case of Memorial Day, to tend war veterans' graves. But for King, they had to pass secondary legislation to say it's not a day off, it's a day of community service. Each King Day is marked by a presidential proclamation, initiated in 1995 by Clinton, who summed up King's central imperative as the question. And this kind of shows how you strip away the politics from Martin Luther King. The central imperative for Martin Luther King, according to Bill Clinton, was, what are you doing for others? Who can argue against that? The majority of proclamations have predictably cited the I Have a Dream speech. George W. Bush showed characteristically his imagination by referring to it in all 8 proclamations, even in the context of the 2002 call for Americans to remain united against terrorism in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. So he manages to get the I Have a Dream speech behind the war on terror. The change instigated by the 1994 Act does seem to confirm the threat that scholar Michael Dyson has detected in the cession of control of King's image to the federal government. As the nation's first African-American president, Barack Obama has perhaps predictably taken a different tack to his predecessors in his King Day proclamations. He has referenced King's final Memphis address more often to indicate that the promised land lies ahead, and so the struggle for justice continues. Like Clinton, he has spoken of the moral imperative to help others, and in 2010 he commended specifically efforts to help the victims of the Haitian earthquake. In 2011, with economic issues paramount, Obama referred again to the mountaintop of justice to which King led Americans and extolled them to work for economic security for all. Obama inevitably did reference the 1963 March on Washington as its 50th anniversary loomed, and the King Monument, about which I'm going to be talking a lot, complete with truncated reference to King as a drum major for justice, was unveiled on the Mall in 2011. So if you can barely read the thing on the right, it says, King is saying to Obama, so that was my dream, what's your dream? And Obama is replying, to not piss off rich people, that's really about it. Obama has also recognised the quiet heroes whose names never appear in history books, urging collective engagement in the continuing quest for justice. He echoed this reference to multitudes of men and women who struggled for justice and equality in his proclamation in 2013, and continued to stress mutual obligations that formed part of the march to freedom and justice. This culminated in Obama's speech at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, where he declared the tireless teacher who gets in early and stays late and dips into her own pocket to buy supplies because she believes that every child is her charge. She's marching. And there's a long list of these things that Obama says constitute marching, and the only thing they have in common is they don't actually involve marching. While more nuanced and truthful about the movement's collective character, Obama's rhetoric nevertheless has taken King's memory away from protest and misapplied it to the daily tasks of life that make an unjust society bearable. It celebrates the accommodation that makes injustice bearable rather than the protest that declares it intolerable. Just as the holiday has become much more an affirmation of America's civil religion, the insurgent right has continued to try to co-opt Martin Luther King's memory, even while its cruder elements still denounce him as unworthy of respect. So in 2010, the Fox News pundit and right-wing activist, particularly with the Tea Party, Glenn Beck, organised a mass rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial of restoring honour to America, deliberately invoking King's memory, even while it espoused a conservative agenda that attracted an overwhelmingly white audience. Beck's controversial opinions appeal mainly to Obama's harshest critics, and his vision of extremely limited government runs directly contrary to King's vision of social democracy with state underwritten guarantees of equal employment, education, housing, justice, and healthcare in the context of a guaranteed minimum income. Organising a counter-rally to Becks, New York's flamboyant black preacher activist Al Sharpton declared, "We ain't giving them this day, this is our day." Becks marchers chanted, "USA, USA." Sharpton's replied, MLK, MLK. To the neutral observer, neither side was particularly edifying. By the early 21st century, it is clear that no figure from the recent American past is memorialized to the same extent as Martin Luther King. Streets are renamed after him in hundreds of American cities and other cities around the world. There is a Boulevard de Martin Luther King on the outskirts of Nantes. There are parks named in Martin Luther King's honour in Paris, Amsterdam and Frankfurt. The Cook Islands in the Pacific issued these 2 silver coins celebrating King and Obama in 2010. And King has featured on stamps, not just from the United States, but India, Ghana, Cuba, Laos, St. Lucia, Yemen, Paraguay, and many other countries. Clearly his image sells stamps. One of the worst, in my opinion, memorials to King is above the west entrance of Westminster Abbey in London. And I don't think it really deserves any further comment.
Oh my God.
For the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the huge statue of King at the centre of the King Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. This is, just to say one thing about this, which is largely about the other people. They are modern martyrs, Elizabeth of Austria and Cardinal Romero of Mexico City. But the less said about Martin Luther King in that image, the better. By 2011, American public opinion had swung decisively behind Martin Luther King, with a Gallup poll showing that 94% of Americans viewed him favourably, 4% unfavourably, and 2% had no opinion at all. The same poll found that over half, 51%, believed that his dream had been realised. And another 23% felt that major progress had been achieved in realising the dream. So nearly 3/4 of Americans believed that King achieved major progress towards the dream. So as the memorial was readied for its unveiling, nearly 3/4 of Americans felt good about King. Like most monuments, the King Memorial has taken time to materialise, with the legislation being passed during Bill Clinton's second term in November 1996. It was opened in 2011. In 1999, the National Capital Planning Commission agreed its location between the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. All other major monuments on the Mall commemorate either a war or a president. Building monuments cost money and need prestigious names on the organising body to pull in the cash. The King Memorial Foundation had 4 living ex-presidents: former First Lady Nancy Reagan, fashion designer Tom Helfinger, David Stern of the National Basketball Association, and 6 distinguished African Americans: ex-General and Secretary of State Colin Powell, ex-Atlanta Mayor and UN Ambassador Andrew Young, Russell Simons of Def Jam Records, an ex-president of the National Urban League and Clinton confidant Vernon Jordan, and Harry Johnson of King's old fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha, who first proposed the memorial. Johnson oversaw the raising of $112 million for the monument. As some colleagues are aware, I have developed an unhealthy interest in fundraising efforts, and for me, the donor list for the memorial is revealing of its true purpose and character, which is not to promote radical social and economic change in the United States. Only $10 million came from the federal government, on whose land the memorial stands. The major corporate donor list includes a list of financial institutions that figure prominently in the credit crunch of 2008. Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase. They include giant conglomerates like General Motors, General Electric, and AT&T that were frankly not at the forefront of pressing for racial equality. Giant pharmaceuticals like Pfizer, petrochemical companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and arms manufacturers like BAE. That's a check for $1 million from BAE. And this is the commission for the Martin Luther King Memorial, being given the pleasure of opening the New York Stock Exchange. Other donors include food retailers like PepsiCo and McDonald's, who played such an enormous part in the evolution of the American diet. And not forgetting the scourge of unionism in the retail sector, Walmart. The ideological gulf between the actual Martin Luther King and the sponsors of his memorial is almost galactic in scale. In 1999, the Memorial Foundation held an international competition to design the memorial, and its executive architect, Ed Jackson, explained that its goal was to create a King monument that would express his global significance rather than his narrowly American one. So they did it for us too. When the prize winner, Roma, a design group from San Francisco, was announced, it emerged that their design would create an uplifting environment where people of different persuasions could come together in unity and peace. There would be no hint of conflict in a design that would be thematically linked to King's I Have a Dream address, given at the nearby Lincoln Memorial. In contrast to King's recognition that power yields nothing without demand, and his belief that non-violence could create a crisis of such tension that it required parties to address issues that they had refused to confront, the Roma Design sought a monument to peace and harmony. The design called for a plaza surrounded by walls on which 14 quotations from Dr. King would be inscribed. To select these quotations, the Memorial Foundation conferred with a distinguished group of historians that included King's Morehouse classmate, Leron Bennett, the editor of the Martin Luther King's Papers Project at Stanford, Claiborne Carson, the director of the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates, as well as the poetess Maya Angelou and the peace activist and self-help guru Marianne Williamson. Since the central statue was to be entitled the Stone of Hope, a phrase from the I Have a Dream speech, the design accepted that the other quotations should come from other moments in King's life from 1955 to 1968. So an effort was made to be comprehensive and informed. However, the sincerity of that effort was stymied by the overarching concern that the King Memorial should not be divisive or partisan, but unifying and universal. As a result, the quotations tend to be soaring platitudes to which few people can object. They include some of Martin's famous ones, like "We shall overcome, because the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And some that are not famous. "If we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must be ecumenical rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend our race, our tribe, our class and our nation. And this means we must develop a world perspective." What the quotations generally fail to capture is that King had come to realize that conflict had to be embraced rather than evaded to achieve progress. And this becomes apparent when one notes how certain sections of certain speeches are used, while others, arguably more famous, are not. On April the 4th, 1967, at the Riverside Church in New York, King gave his speech Beyond Vietnam, explaining why he had decided to come out wholeheartedly against the war. In that speech, he called his own government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. This finds no place at the memorial, which includes the following quotation: "I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out against it not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all, with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as a moral example of the world." The second quotation is not false. Martin did say that, and one can readily see how King wanted to position his anti-war stance in a way that rejected the charges of disloyalty levelled against him in 1967. But the difference between the omitted quotation that accuses America and the second one that honours it is a measure of how far King has been sculpted into a safe national hero. Even more marginalised at the exhibit and monument is the reality that King believed that his government should underwrite human rights of all Americans to food, shelter, education, employment, healthcare and justice in a way that Scandinavian social democracies had done in the 1960s. Such a vision of cradle-to-grave care for everyone was too radical for inclusion 50 years later. Since the Commission seemed so intent on making the memorial non-controversial, it is perhaps ironic that it evoked immediate controversy by assigning the task of sculpting the central Stone of Hope figure to a Chinese artist, Lei Yi Xing, without a competitive process and inspired at least partly by the fact that this might enable them to use Chinese granite and Chinese labour and so reduce the monument's costs. The California chapter of the NAACP saw his appointment as an insult that implied that America did not possess sculptors of sufficient talent. Lei's previous work had included celebratory monuments to Mao, and his initial outline of the sculpture was seen by critics as still locked in the kind of social realism that had produced statues so recently toppled as dictatorships fell from Romania to Iraq. Overall criticism of the decision mixed jingoism with barely concealed anti-Chinese racist sentiments, even spreading the rumour that the Commission had taken a bribe from the Chinese government. The central part of the memorial has two parts, one of rough stone and the other has the standing figure of King emerging from the stone with an inscription linking the two: "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." King as a man emerges from the stone of hope, and his pose, which Lei consistently describes as thoughtful, has been seen by others as confrontational. Lei took his inspiration from a photo of King in his SCLC offices with Gandhi on the wall that has been widely reproduced on the cover of Clay Carson's best-selling edited account of King's life, the autobiography of Martin Luther King. King never wrote an autobiography, but he wrote some pieces which Carson has put together. But if you compare the two, one can see that the two-dimensional photo captures King with a bit more warmth and eye contact with someone out of shot than Lei can achieve in the towering statue. It's over 7'7" tall. This is in spite of the fact that the Federal Commission for Fine Art responded to his initial clay model by asking for the brow to be softened, less furrowed, and the mouth expression too to be more relaxed. James Chofer, an African-American artistic consultant on the project, said, "We see him as a warrior for peace, not as some pacifist kind of vanilla, but really a man of great conviction and strength When the monument was finally opened in 2011, Schoeffer's allusion to a kind of vanilla acquired a different resonance. The Commission had defended its selection of a Chinese artist partly because they felt that only in the granite quarries of China could they find stone of the right shade. In hindsight, this seems the oddest part of the entire process. In the bright summer sun especially, the king figure is starkly, disturbingly white. In some of his speeches, King occasionally used the biblical phrase whitened sepulchres to describe moderate churchmen who preach the gospel but do not act to make it real. Perhaps one should not be surprised, as an official monument is not a call to arms against the unjust society that has authorised the monument. But for me, the only good thing about the monument is the confrontational pose. The rest seems almost a whitewash. King deserves to be remembered, not just in Black History Month, but all year round. Thank you very much.
Yeah, why China?
Why China?
Yeah.
Why? The artist was competing in effectively a competition for sculptors in Minnesota when he was drawn to the attention of the commission that felt he could contribute. They were showing some concern about the escalating costs. They'd been basically told they would need to raise $120 million. And they also were persuaded that it should be an international monument, and so it need not necessarily be an American artist. And the commission felt that this man's previous work showed that he could work on this scale, and that was another consideration. But clearly it was a controversial decision at the time. There were a few people who said, why can't we have an African-American sculptor do a monument to the most famous African-American of the last 50 years? But also, there were some people who just felt it ought to be American. You've also got to think back to the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, when there's concern about outsourcing of jobs. And China is seen as the great economic rival. So that also feeds into the controversy over what are you doing giving all this work to China. But clearly they felt he could do the work well, and they felt that they had things they could get out of the relationship. But there's no evidence, as was accused at the time, that the Chinese government gave a hefty donation.
Yeah, even though you said you don't really want to talk about it, I actually want to know the reasoning for Westminster in unveiling that statue of MLK in the martyrs section. Like, why?
Well, they had decided at the time. This is Westminster Abbey, so it's the lead church in some respects of one of the leading churches of the Anglican communion. And at the same time, Cardinal John Paul was making a big deal about making saints of contemporary people who died for their faith. So there was a certain degree of kind of competition between the different denominations, and they felt they ought to no longer just have saints who were medieval saints or stained glass saints. They ought to recognise people who have devoted their lives and given their lives to moral causes. So the thinking behind it was reasonably sound. The problem is the execution. in that, if I can go back to it, it just is badly done, and in particular, the image of the child at the feet of King seems to, and Zoe could speak to this, seems to evoke all those 19th century images of the petitioning, humble, am I not a man and a brother kind of attitude.
Also the outstretched hand.
And then the outstretched hand as well, you know. It is, I don't know what they were thinking, is my answer. I'm sure if I knew more about Cardinal Romero, his too might be bad as well, but they decided they wanted to have some recognition of him rather than not to recognise his contribution, and they just did a bad job.
In terms of the whitening process, what's your view on the argument that Europeans have sort of selected their preferred black heroes, and so King is one of the chosen ones.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela is another individual as well, and so you know they more or less selected our heroes and presented them, packaged them, as you said, sort of distorted perhaps their real historical achievements, and then said, well, these are your heroes, and if you do desire to challenge white supremacy, or however you may term it, these are the two, you know, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King in particular, that are the examples you should follow. What's your view on that?
Well, I think there's some truth to it, and I think the truth grows out of the fact that the media are largely dominated by Western forces, white Western forces. So even at the time, if you want to get the widest possible recognition for your cause, you engage with what is largely a white media. And that becomes part of the challenge you face. So what is generally the argument in relation to King is that King gets a positive press and Malcolm X gets a negative press.
Yes.
The only problem I have with that is that King didn't get that much of a positive press at the time. 66% of Americans thought that he was a bad thing in 1966, and it was an even larger proportion of Americans by 1968 because he'd come out against the Vietnam War. So I don't think the press necessarily gave King an easy ride. I think they distorted his message and were part of the reason why people did believe that non-violence was about peace and not necessarily about creative conflict. They didn't let Malcolm change as he did after going to Mecca and coming back, and continue to bring up the issues. The problem with this process is that it is, you have to engage, and to some extent part of what you do is to respond to it. So certainly in the case of Malcolm X, when he's on the radio or going to white campuses and talking to predominantly white audiences, he knows and enjoys the shock factor. He wants to see these white people cringe in their seats as he explains to them in details what utter bastards they are. You know, he really lays it on the line for them, and he knows that that will play in the black community, and they will get the thrill of seeing somebody say to white people what they've been thinking all these years but never had the opportunity to say. So there's a great sense in which black power is expressed by just speaking truth to power. The problem is that power just doesn't let it lie there like that as a message back to the black community. It will take those angry words and it will blow them up and it will present them again in ways that say, look, this guy is dangerous to us and he needs to be taken down. And when he changes his opinion, we're not going to allow him. We're going to keep giving him the same quotations back about you're actually a man of violence, you're not a man of non-violence. So it's a dangerous game, and to some extent black power becomes strangled by that. They want to get the message out, but their ability to do so beyond the local community is hamstrung by control of the white media. Mandela is a really interesting case because it's only when he's in jail a long time and is then released and he isn't going to be a threat to anybody that they suddenly find that he's a really wonderful guy. Margaret Thatcher was denouncing Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. So Nelson Mandela was not a hero for white elites until he was in a position where he would be likely to bargain with them rather than threaten them. So I think that is an interesting case.
But it replicates itself.
It replicates.
You have this statue in London of Nelson.
Yeah.
You know, there's a whole argument between Nelson Mandela versus Stephen Biko.
Yeah.
And so on. You know, it almost seems coordinated in terms of white geopolitics, you know, in the way things happen. And even if you look at the curriculum in this country, even at nurseries, you know, right through to secondary school, if they do touch on history, African American civil rights history, the focus is Martin Luther King, and quite prominently in schools up and down in Britain, you know, you'll see biographies of Martin Luther King. So there is this selective process, almost coordinated, almost institutional, to say those are good black heroes, and we're happy to talk about them.
I don't mind them talking about Martin Luther King if they do it accurately and explain that what he is about actually confronting injustice. He's not about being nice. He's not polite. Non-violence isn't about politeness. I think the problem with the way in which Martin Luther King is represented, and you're right, there are a huge number of children's books about Martin Luther King aimed at the very young audience, where he basically comes across as somebody who's just kind of gentle and kind and noble. And eventually, of course, in these storybook versions, all the good white people come to Martin's help and they overturn the few bad guys. You know, another part of our story is it's amazing how few racists there are when racism is defeated. So in the south of the United States, you only had these very strange delinquent guys like Bull Connor and Jim Clark in Selma, and you can almost see them playing the cartoon villain on the newsreel, and then all the other white Southerners are just nice people. And as soon as Martin was able to tell them that they didn't need to be nasty anymore, they ceased to be nasty. So I think you're right, there are some dangerous messages being sent, and I would certainly say in your schools, make sure that your children know about the struggle and how it actually happened. Don't let them take the messages that they're being force-fed. Is there another question at the back?
Yeah, I was just saying that Marty's been sort of contextualised in terms of the way it was with civil rights. Do you think he died before he sort of concluded and matured his thoughts in terms of where he was actually going?
Malcolm.
Not Malcolm, sorry, Martin Luther King. Do you think that he died before his thoughts became mature to a position where he was actually going to say, well, this is what he wanted to, this is the position he wanted with white society?
Well, I think in the case of Martin Luther King in 1968, I mean, when I was writing about him, I read everything that he had written and said in the last 18 months of his life, very intensely. And it's a particularly awful period for him because he feels that everybody is looking to him for some kind of magic solution as things go bad on so many different fronts. Everybody wants a slice of him to kind of help them with their cause. And he says to his followers, I am going to go for broke. I'm not going to be politically sensitive anymore, I'm going to go for broke. So he goes out and he says, America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and I cannot stand for that. We must block the war in Vietnam. It's actually destroying our country. At the same time, he says, I want to get 100,000 people to come to Washington, D.C. as a non-violent army and tie up the nation's capital in time of war with non-violent tactics and say, we will not leave until you guarantee every human being in America a decent living, a job or an income. That sounds like somebody who's got very clear goals and a pretty determined and radical approach to it. I mean, the idea of 100,000 people in Washington having to be arrested and carried away is a spectacle we haven't witnessed before. And if America is still going to present itself globally as a liberal democracy, how is it going to do that? Oh yeah, we are the champions of the free world. We're just taking 100,000 people and putting them in concentration camps. So I think King's strategy was a radical one and a determined one. The problem was that his enemies recognized how dangerous he was. And so the counterintelligence program that I was talking about put people inside the SCLC and inside the Poor People's Campaign to deliberately make it more difficult for it to work. They were working from the inside to destroy it. The guy who was running the books at SCLC was a paid FBI informant from 1964 onwards. And whenever he had to send out details to SCLC officers in the field, he would copy in the FBI, and then they would know all the people who were working in the office, and any people they'd recruited, and they would put pressure on them. So he was already fighting for this against extreme opposition. But I can't think of what he would, the only thing I can ever think of Martin Luther King missing is to some extent sexism, in that he continued to be blind to the role of women in his organisation. And to some extent, as everybody really was at that time, he was very, he wasn't alert yet to environmentalism. So the guaranteed income is a very popular slogan, but if you think of a guaranteed income for every human being on the planet, what are the ecological implications of that? Particularly if they're going to live like Americans. So he would have continued to develop and grow, I think, but he was as radical as he needed to be in 1968. The reason why I thought you might be talking about Malcolm is that clearly Malcolm didn't have the time between leaving the Nation of Islam and his death in February 1965 to really work through what he wanted and how he would go about achieving it. So he is somebody who I don't see at the time of his death as having a clear-cut agenda of what he's trying to achieve and how he's trying to achieve it.
And just one other thing. We have the assassination of the non-conformists and the conformists in terms of Malcolm and Martin Luther King. Do you think that affected future leaders as to people sort of putting their head above the parapet and actually becoming effective leaders? I mean, after that, we don't seem to have had any effective leaders.
Certainly, the violence of 1968 has a chilling effect because, of course, even somebody who's just an old-fashioned liberal like Bobby Kennedy is murdered in 1968 as well. So there is a sense by the summer of 1968 that American politics is in a very dark space in which you're going to choose between George Wallace and Richard Nixon if you are worried about your future as a white person, and the war. You know, Hubert Humphrey is not going to make any waves because of the war in Vietnam. Whether it's in the longer term, I think the problem has been that although non-violence has continued to be the most effective repertoire for social protest movements around the world, usually in combination, it has to be said, with armed struggle. They don't use one, they use both. There hasn't been another leader who has championed protest in quite the same way. I don't think those kinds of leaders look at history and say they shot the last guy, so I'm not going to do it. I think they just believe that they have to do it. Yeah.
But don't you think that white America never wanted racial equality in the first place? For me, Martin Luther King fought, for Martin Luther King, for me, fought a wrong battle. Because the battle was not for racial equality. The battle should have been for economic emancipation. Because what we've seen is two problems. African Americans were better off under segregation than they are now. If you look at all the stats during, sort of before desegregation and after desegregation, African Americans are actually worse off now than they were during slavery. So Martin Luther King was fighting for the wrong thing. And two, white America never wanted peace in the first place. White America, since the inception of the first Africans who landed in Plymouth Rock, never ever wanted Africans to be free. That's obviously, which is one of the reasons why the Civil War was fought. The Civil War was fought to maintain slavery, particularly in the South, or to say rather enslavement of the South. And when we look at all the indicators, even when you have your so-called black president, America has never apologized for the brutal treatment of blacks, and this brutal treatment of blacks goes on to today, whereby you have white police officers openly killing black people, black men, black women, black children. So America, particularly white American establishment, have never ever wanted peace in terms of, or given equality to blacks in America. And the fact that both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were assassinated was a warning to other black radicals, so that if you ever try to go out the script that we've given you, you're going to be dealt with. And it's the same thing that's happened in Africa. When people like Patrice Lumumba was killed by the CIA, FBI, people like Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by the CIA, FBI, that again was a message from the white elite in America to radical Africans that if you dare challenge the status quo, white supremacy, the hegemony or white supremacy, we're going to deal with you. And this is why, in terms of black leadership, there's been no so-called black leader, radical or whatever, since Malcolm X. And even Farrakhan himself, Louis Farrakhan, there's been times in his life, because he's been deemed by the white establishment as a radical person. When all he's fighting for, basically, is to emancipate blacks from their mental enslavement and to ensure that black people in America actually do for self, rather than depending on the welfare and on the welfare state that has systematically, since the declaration of the Civil Rights Bill, and even before that, since the emancipation of us as being enslaved people, has not worked. So in terms of your argument, I think your argument is based on the fact that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X didn't know where they wanted to go. I think both of them, particularly Malcolm X, just for me, as a good thing, because he was promoting self-will, self-reliance of the black community, do for self, not to rely on a white establishment or white elite establishment, and for us as a people, right, to actually incorporate our own businesses. And the fact of my proof is saying that white America never wanted blacks to be free. If you take a couple of examples. One, the Oklahoma example, where there was a thriving black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and because this community was a thriving black community economically, that community was destroyed by the white elite. And two, when we look at even the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, whereby the white elite systematically gave black men syphilis to actually depopulate the black community. So I think white America has never ever wanted Africans in America to be free.
I quite agree with you that there have always been interests in America that do not want racism to be dismantled, that they do begin to see that it helps them in various ways. But I mean, there's the big difference between people who feel that the explanation for history is all about individuals and persons, and people who believe that the explanation for history is about more structural changes. I think that both Malcolm and Martin believed that change to the structure could come about if they fought against the structure as it stood. I think they both believed that. I get uncomfortable about narratives of history that try to make everything fit together into a conspiracy where certain people are organising events and it always turns out their way. In my own life experience, it doesn't seem to be that well planned and plotted. Instead, things are happening and you have varying degrees of control over them. So what Malcolm and Martin were trying to do was to enable African Americans to have more control over the things that they encountered. And I think on occasion they did manage to achieve that, but it's, you know, one of the old slogans is that freedom is a constant struggle. So we're not going to necessarily get rid of white supremacy in an instant, we're not going to get rid of inequality in an instant, but the more we struggle against inequality and against white supremacy, the more progress we may make.
Can I just say, those of you who know me know I'm very good campaigner as well, but I think what you said was really important about accuracy of history and from whose perspective is really important.
Yeah.
We've just been to the Liverpool Slave Museum. I went there years ago when it wasn't long open, and I just felt that the history was not from the perspective of the black slaves. It was primarily from the history of maybe some woman who was married to the slave owners who could write and could, was a little bit sympathetic. And I do feel that I work in health, that we need to have the narratives of the people who have had the experience. For example, when I first started working with black and ethnic groups, I was asked by white consultants why I felt I needed to do that. And even when I go into, you know, the NHS, you still get those people who don't even know what BME means, black minority ethnic. And at the same time, when we started the support groups, we had black people who perhaps didn't share the experience saying, why do you need a black support group? And yet when I look at the evidence, even when I've done the prostate cancer report here now, but when I look at black women with breast cancer, they're getting breast cancer on average at the age of 50, where white women are 62. They're the youngest people. And we do need to base what we do on evidence, but we also need to have those stories, those experiences. And in St. Anne's, for example, there are shared experience between those who have grown up together. There's a lot of mixed relationships and there's a lot of socioeconomic deprivation, but we need to get the accurate history from the perspective of those who need change.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, we have champions who may not have had the shared experience, but get it because they understand the evidence. And I think with both these men, they were trying to change something that was an injustice, using not only the shared experience, but the evidence as well. And I think when you have that evidence, and when you present it well, you become a challenge as well. So you can get character assassination. For example, Mary Seacole, recently we covered it on Kemet, where Mary Seacole's statue is almost reached the point where they can actually raise all the money to do it. Professor Elizabeth Anyonwu is one of the most foremost experts on it. Yet she was not on the TV programme that talked about Mary Seacole. And she's been doing a lot of the fundraising herself. She just sent me a message to say it's almost done. And yet, we saw in The Guardian an article which was a character assassination of Mary Seacole that said she was only a businesswoman. She went there to get rich. You know, these sort of things are not helpful. And we do need to speak out as the black community. When I went to my daughter's secondary school, my first daughter, I looked at what was being depicted on the walls of black people, and I said, why?
Yeah.
You know, why are you just depicting it as developing countries needing help from white communities? And that started to change. My daughter has gone in and said, why is Black history all about To Kill a Mockingbird? You know, we have to teach our children to ask questions as well. But we also have to get people into the media. You look at that, you see how much power the media has. And even when I started doing media interviews, I remember doing a media interview where I did this, he's so trusting, and when I saw the article that came out of what I said, it bore no resemblance to what I said. And so I called up the newspaper and basically challenged it. But we have to really teach our children to as well. Black history needs to be taught from our perspective. Our stories need to be captured. We've got Norma here, who's a journalist. We need to capture them from our perspective and actually join it with the experience and the evidence to actually make change through the generations, not just stopping at one generation. So thank you. You know, that was an interesting
perspective. This is just only an aside. In speaking about Malcolm and also Martin Luther King, who represent radical Black leadership in the United States and perhaps in the world, the question is often asked, what is happening today? Throughout the world, we don't seem to have the Black leadership, radical leadership, existing anymore. Those voices were made quiet. And at the time when I left the United States, it was sort of commonly believed that the forces that made it possible to lose Black leadership, they did it using 3 different techniques. And the organizations that you mentioned several, SNCC, I don't know if you mentioned the NAACP.
In passing, yeah.
Yeah.
The one that lasted, yeah.
And you mentioned the Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
And what has happened in common with all of those, and all of them have produced leaders. Those leaders were either, I hate to say it this way, but they were sexed out. They were criminalized, thrown into jail, and if none of those methods worked, they were assassinated. And the assassinations took place on lots of different levels, even before someone would reach the stature of a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X. But I believe that explanation at the time when I left the States, which is the mid-60s, I believe that is really why we have no leadership today.
Well, another reason that's given sometimes in the United States is that the civil rights changes of the 1960s opened up small windows for certain African Americans to benefit.
Yes.
And so today in the United States, the African American middle class, the upper class, is much larger than it was in the 1950s. They don't usually live in the communities where most African Americans live anymore. So as a result, you have a different community pattern in which African Americans who go on to grad school, who go on into the business leadership roles, are often more detached from their communities than they were in the 50s and 60s. So, you know, I was pretty tough on Barack Obama in this presentation, and I admire him in many ways, but nonetheless, there is clearly a difference between somebody who stays in the south side or west side of Chicago and lives there and sends his kids to school there and does all the other things, and somebody who moves to Hyde Park and then goes to Harvard and then becomes part of a much different class set than the majority of African Americans living in the Chicago metropolitan area. It is difficult now for African American communities to find the range of leaders that they would have encountered in the 1960s and 70s. Some of that is down to the hostile activities that you're talking about, But other parts of it is about that for ordinary people, if you get the chance to move up yourself, it is a big ask for you to decide that instead you're going to dedicate yourself to the broader community. Very few people actually do that in their lives. So I think that what the African American community has experienced is something that most communities have some sense of, which is when you get some success, you sometimes move away rather than staying closer to the community that you came from.